The dining room was heavy with the smell of turkey and the weight of family expectations. I sat at my usual spot at the Thanksgiving table, wedged between my cousin Sarah and my Aunt Linda, trying to make myself as small as possible while my grandfather held court at the head of the table. He was in rare form that year, pontificating about hard work and real jobs, his voice booming across the mashed potatoes and gravy boats with the confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years in the steel mill and believed that was the only kind of work that mattered. I was 26 then, living in a cramped studio apartment in Portland, spending my days and most of my nights bent over my work table with threads, needles, and fabric scraps scattered around me like confetti. I'd been making custom embroidered pieces for about 2 years, selling them on Etsy and at local craft markets, barely scraping by but happier than I'd ever been in my brief stint at the marketing firm after college. That job had paid well, but left me hollow, staring at spreadsheets and feeling like I was disappearing a little more each day. My mother had made the mistake of mentioning my little Etsy shop during the pre-dinner small talk, probably trying to fill the awkward silence that always seemed to descend when my grandfather asked about my career prospects. I'd seen her face fall immediately when his eyes lit up with that particular gleam that meant he was about to deliver one of his lessons about life. Embroidery, he'd said, drawing the word out like he was tasting something sour. That's nice, sweetheart. Good to have hobbies. Keeps your hands busy. I'd smiled tightly and reached for the cranberry sauce, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. But you're looking for real work, right? He continued, loading his plate with turkey. Something with benefits, a retirement plan. Your cousin Marcus just got promoted at the insurance company. They're always hiring. I could give him your number. The table had gone quiet in that way families do when someone's about to be gently eviscerated under the guise of concern. My father cleared his throat. My mother suddenly became very interested in passing the rolls. Sarah, bless her, tried to change the subject to her new apartment, but Grandpa Joe was on a roll. I'm just saying, he pressed on, pointing his fork at me for emphasis, you can't build a life on a hobby. You need stability, a real income. What you're doing, this craft thing, it's nice for fun, but it's not working. Not really. It's just a hobby. Those words landed like stones in my stomach. Just a hobby. I'd heard variations of this from other relatives, from my college advisor, from my ex-boyfriend who couldn't understand why I'd give up a salary and health insurance to play with fabric. But hearing it from Grandpa Joe, who I'd always adored despite his old-fashioned views, who used to let me sit in his workshop as a kid and hand him tools while he built birdhouses, somehow hurt more. I didn't argue. I nodded, murmured something noncommittal, and spent the rest of dinner pushing sweet potatoes around my plate while the conversation mercifully moved on to football and my uncle's new boat. But something had shifted in me during that meal. The words, just a hobby, kept echoing in my head, and with each repetition they transformed into a dismissal, into a challenge. I drove back to Portland that night with my Tupperware containers of leftovers and a fire in my chest that I hadn't felt since I'd first picked up an embroidery hoop. My apartment seemed smaller than ever when I walked in, but my work table in the corner, illuminated by the standing lamp I bought at a yard sale, looked like a command center. I set down the leftovers, made myself a cup of coffee despite the late hour, and pulled out my notebook. I'd been treating my embroidery like a hobby, I realized. I'd been apologetic about it, almost embarrassed when people asked what I did for work. I'd been pricing my pieces based on what I thought people might pay, not on the hours of work they represented. I'd been afraid to call myself an artist or a business owner because some part of me had internalized exactly what my grandfather had said. This wasn't real work. That night, I made a plan. Not a vague, someday I'll do this dream, but an actual business plan with goals and timelines and research. I stayed up until 4 a.m, my laptop screen glowing in the dark, learning about LLCs and tax structures, studying successful fiber artists and their pricing strategies, mapping out a social media presence that was more than just sporadic posts when I remembered. The next day, exhausted but determined, I took my best piece, a large embroidered portrait I'd made of the Portland skyline with the mountains in the background, and instead of listing it on Etsy for $200 like I'd planned, I contacted a local gallery. They agreed to display it on consignment. 2 weeks later, it sold for $800, and the gallery owner asked if I had more work. That was the beginning. I started saying yes to things that scared me. A local boutique wanted to carry my embroidered patches and pins on commission. I said yes. A magazine reached out asking if I'd be interested in being featured in an article about Portland artists. I said yes. Someone asked if I taught classes. I'd never taught anything in my life, but I said yes and spent a frantic week putting together a curriculum for basic embroidery techniques. The classes where everything started to multiply. I rented space at a community art center for 3 hours every Saturday morning, charging $30 per person for a beginner embroidery workshop. The first class had 4 people. The second had 8. By the third month, I had a waiting list and had to add Thursday evening sessions. People loved the meditative quality of embroidery, the way it forced them to slow down and focus on something tactile in an increasingly digital world. But I was still barely making rent. The money from classes and sales was inconsistent, and I was starting to panic that maybe my grandfather had been right all along. That moment of doubt came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in February when I was looking at my bank account and trying to figure out if I could afford both groceries and art supplies that week. That's when I got an email that changed everything. A woman named Rebecca had taken my Saturday class, and she worked in corporate team building. Her company was looking for creative workshop facilitators for their quarterly retreat. Would I be interested in teaching a private embroidery session for 30 employees at $200 per person? I read that email 5 times, certain I was misunderstanding. $6,000 for a single workshop? I wrote back immediately, trying to sound professional and not like someone who was about to cry in relief in her kitchen at 3 a.m. The corporate workshop was terrifying. I showed up at this gleaming office building in the financial district with bags full of hoops and thread and printed instructions. Sure, I was going to bomb, but the employees loved it. They loved having something to do with their hands that wasn't typing. They loved making something personal and unique. They loved the Instagram-worthy setup I'd created with vintage hoops and carefully curated color palettes. 3 of them booked private lessons with me on the spot, and Rebecca promised to recommend me to her network. She kept that promise. Over the next 6 months, I taught workshops for tech companies, law firms, a hospital staff retreat, and a bride who wanted her bridesmaids to make embroidered handkerchiefs as part of the bachelorette party. Each workshop led to more referrals. I raised my rates. I hired an assistant, a recent art school graduate named Maya, who was even more enthusiastic about embroidery than I was. I moved out of my studio into a 1-bedroom with enough space for a dedicated workspace. I bought supplies in bulk. I created an LLC.
By the time Thanksgiving rolled around again, I had taught over 60 workshops, sold pieces through 3 galleries, had a standing monthly column in a craft magazine, and was in talks with a publisher about writing a beginner's guide to modern embroidery. My income had tripled. I had health insurance through the Freelancers Union. I was paying quarterly estimated taxes like a proper business owner. I thought about not going to Thanksgiving dinner that year. Part of me wanted to avoid the inevitable questions and judgments, to skip the whole performance of family expectations. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last year building something real and substantial, wanted to show up. Not to gloat, not to prove anyone wrong, but because I was proud of what I'd built, and I was tired of being apologetic about it. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had the year before. The same floral tablecloth and good china my grandmother had left behind, the same seating arrangement with Grandpa Joe at the head of the table. I'd brought a homemade pie and a bottle of good wine, both of which I could now afford without checking my bank balance first. That felt like its own small victory. Dinner progressed normally for the first hour. Pass the turkey. These rolls are delicious. Did you hear about the neighbor's new car? The usual safe topics that families use to avoid anything too real. I was content to let the evening pass that way, to eat my dinner and go home without any confrontation. But then my cousin Marcus, the one with the insurance job my grandfather had wanted me to emulate, asked what I'd been up to. "Still doing the embroidery thing?" he asked. And I could hear the slight condescension in his voice, the implication that it was cute I was still playing around with my little hobby. I took a sip of wine and met his eyes. "I am. Actually, I just signed a book deal with Chronicle Books. It'll be out next fall." The table went Silent. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My father's eyebrows shot up. Sarah grinned at me from across the table, clearly delighted. "A book deal?" my Aunt Linda said. "For embroidery?" "It's a beginner's guide to contemporary embroidery techniques," I explained, trying to keep my voice casual, even though my heart was pounding. They approached me after seeing my work in Taproot magazine. "That's wonderful, honey," my mother said, her voice warm with pride and maybe a little relief that I hadn't ended up destitute as she'd quietly feared. I could feel my grandfather's eyes on me. When I looked his way, he was studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're making money from this?" he asked, his tone not confrontational but genuinely curious. "I am. I teach corporate workshops mostly, team building sessions, creative retreats, that sort of thing. I taught 63 workshops this year, and I'm already booked through March for next year. I also sell pieces through galleries and take private commissions. And there's the book advance." I paused, then decided to just own it fully. I made more this year than I did at my marketing job, before taxes at least. Marcus looked like I had announced I was moving to Mars. My Aunt Linda started peppering me with questions about the workshops. My father beamed. But I kept watching my grandfather, waiting for his reaction. He was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for another lecture about stability and real work and the importance of benefits packages. Instead, he set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "I'll be damned. You actually did it." "Did what?" I asked. "Built something. A real business." He shook his head slowly, and I saw something that looked almost like admiration in his eyes. "I thought you were just messing around, killing time until you figured out what you really wanted to do. I was wrong." Those 3 words, "I was wrong," from a man who'd spent his whole life believing there was only one right way to work, to live, to build a future, hit me harder than any praise could have. "It's not the kind of work I understand," he continued. "I spent 40 years making steel. You can touch steel, use it to build things. What you do, it's different. But you're making a living at it. A good living, sounds like. That's what matters." My throat felt tight. "Last year you said it was just a hobby." He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "Last year it looked like a hobby. This year it looks like a business. There's a difference, and you figured out what that difference was. That takes guts and brains." He raised his glass. "I'm proud of you, kid. Even if I don't understand what the hell people want with embroidered pictures when they could just take a photograph." Everyone laughed, and the tension that had been coiling in my chest released at all once. We toasted, and the conversation moved on, but something had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't the granddaughter who was wasting her degree anymore. I wasn't the family worry, the one they whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear. I was a business owner, an author, someone who'd figured out how to make a living doing what she loved. After dinner, while everyone was having pie in the living room, my grandfather pulled me aside in the kitchen. Up close, I noticed how much grayer he'd gotten in the past year, how the lines around his eyes had deepened. He wanted to tell me something, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "When I was your age, maybe a little younger, I wanted to be a carpenter. I was good with wood, loved making things with my hands, but my father told me carpentry wasn't stable enough, said I needed a factory job with union benefits and a pension. So that's what I did. Spent 40 years doing work I was good at, but never loved. I'd never heard this story before." "Grandpa!" He held up a hand. "I'm not saying I regret. I provided for my family, my grandmother and I had a good life. But there were times I wondered what would have happened if I'd just gone for it, tried to make a living doing what I actually wanted to do. I was scared. Hell, everyone was scared back then. It was a different time." He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something raw and honest. "When I said that thing last year about your embroidery being just a hobby, I think part of me was trying to protect you from failing the way I was afraid I would have failed. But another part of me probably was jealous. Jealous that you had the guts to try. I'm still scared all the time," I admitted. "Every time I book a workshop, I'm terrified no one will show up or they'll hate it. Every time I post my work online, I'm sure everyone will think it's terrible. But you do it anyway. That's the difference." He squeezed my shoulder. "Keep doing it. And next Thanksgiving, you tell me about that book. I want a signed copy." You're going to read a book about embroidery? I teased.
Hell no. But I'm going to put it on my coffee table and tell everyone my granddaughter wrote it. He grinned, and I saw a flash of the man who used to let me help him in his workshop, who taught me that making something with your hands was its own kind of magic. That Thanksgiving dinner became a turning point in more ways than one. My grandfather's words, both the ones from the year before and the ones from that night, pushed me to think bigger about what my business could be. If I'd built this much in a year from spite and determination, what could I build with confidence and real support? The book came out the following October to surprisingly strong reviews. It sold well enough that the publisher asked about a second one, this time focusing on advanced techniques. I hired 2 more instructors to help with the workshops, which had expanded to include multi-day retreats and virtual classes. I launched a line of embroidery kits that sold through boutiques across the country. I got invited to teach at craft conferences and fiber arts festivals. 3 years after that second Thanksgiving, I signed a lease on a small storefront in Portland's Arts District. Half workshop space, half gallery, with a cozy section where people could sit and stitch together in comfortable chairs surrounded by thread and inspiration. I called it Stitched, and on opening day, my entire family showed up, even my grandfather, who walked through the space slowly, taking in the displays of finished work, the shelves of supplies, the big work table where classes would be held. "This is really something," he said, and I could hear the wonder in his voice. "You built all this from thread and fabric?" "I built it from being stubborn enough not to quit when people told me it was just a hobby," I corrected gently. He laughed at that. Fair enough. He came to visit the shop every few months after that, usually with my grandmother's sister, his companion after her passing, who actually did take one of my beginner classes and became obsessed with embroidering birds. He'd sit in one of the armchairs with coffee from the shop next door, watching people bent over their hoops with the same focus and satisfaction he must have felt in his workshop all those years ago. The last time he visited, a few weeks before he passed, he told me he'd been thinking about what I'd built and what he'd said that Thanksgiving years ago. "I was wrong to call it a hobby," he said. "But I think maybe I was right too, in a way. The best businesses start as something you love so much you do it for free. That's what a hobby is, really. The trick is figuring out how to make it sustainable without losing the love. You figured that out. Not everyone does." He died quietly in his sleep that winter. And at his funeral, I was surprised to find that he'd been showing my books to everyone at his senior center, that he'd kept printouts of articles about me and my business in a folder he apparently showed to anyone who'd look. My father found a half-finished wooden frame in his workshop, clearly meant to display embroidered work, with measurements that matched my most common hoop size. I think about him often when I'm teaching classes or working on a new piece or dealing with the mundane business parts of running a company, taxes and inventory and marketing plans. Some days are tedious. Some days I'm buried in paperwork or dealing with difficult clients or worrying about cash flow. It's not always romantic or fun, this thing I built from thread and determination. But it's mine. It's real. And it started with someone telling me it was just a hobby, and me deciding to prove them wrong. Every Thanksgiving now, after dinner, when we're all too full and sleepy to do much but sit around and tell stories, someone inevitably asks me about the business. I tell them whatever's new, whatever I'm working on, whatever challenge I'm trying to figure out. And every time, I think about my grandfather and that dinner where he dismissed my work without meaning to hurt me, just because he couldn't imagine a world where embroidery was anything more than something grandmothers did while watching television. He couldn't have known I'd build a business from it. Hell, I didn't know I'd build a business from it. But his words, meant to guide me towards safety, instead lit a fire that's still burning years later. Sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is doubt you loudly enough that you're forced to prove them wrong, if only to prove something to yourself. I keep one of his woodworking tools on my desk at the shop, a small hand plane that fits perfectly in my palm. It reminds me that we're not so different, he and I. We both knew that working with our hands meant something, that creating something beautiful or useful or meaningful was worth the effort, even if the world didn't always see the value in it. He just didn't have the chance or the courage to bet on it the way I did. But maybe in pushing me to find a real job, he gave me something more valuable than approval. He gave me something to push against, a reason to dig deeper and work harder and refuse to give up. He gave me the gift of doubt, which transformed into determination, which transformed into a business, which transformed into a life I love. So yes, Grandpa, you were right. It was a hobby. But you were also wrong. It was never just a hobby. It was always the work I was meant to do. I just needed to figure out how to make the world see it that way too. And I needed someone to tell me I couldn't do it, so I could spend the rest of my life proving that I absolutely could.